This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Chris Davison, head brewer for Wolf's Ridge Brewing in Columbus, Ohio. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jamie. We're really excited.
It's if you're a reader of Craft Beer and Brewing, you saw that Wolf's Ridge was one of our beers of the year this year. It was the double chocolate rum barrel Dire Wolf stout, and that's quite a mouthful. We loved it. It really stood out amongst a lineup of incredible beers that we tasted last year for our Best in Beer issue. Of course, Wolf's Ridge also won a few GABF medals, 2019 silver for Daybreak, a 2020 gold medal for Daybreak, a bronze for the Rauch beer, won some FoBAB medals as well. We are going to talk about barrel-aged beers. We're going to talk about barrel-aged sour beers, barrel-aged clean beers. We're going to talk about adding ingredients to beers and how and lighter beers like Daybreak and how you can get a clear and clean coffee expression in an otherwise pale and light beer. I'm excited about this conversation. Before we get started, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. New this year, redundancy meets efficiency. G&D's micro-channel condensers are built with all aluminum construction, which eliminates galvanic corrosion. Using half the refrigerant of conventional condensers with fewer brazed connections translates to a lower GWP and less opportunities for leaks. Call G&D Chillers today to discuss your project or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by Crisp Scottish Pale Ale Malt. Crisp Scottish Pale Ale Malt is the workhorse of many a brewery, is at home in a variety of beer styles. Crisp sources the lowest nitrogen spring barley from farmers in Fife up to Moray. During malting, high cast moistures and a balance of optimal germination time and temperature results in an even, well-modified malt with a rich color and balanced sweet malt flavor, ideally suited to ale brewing. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com for more information on Crisp Scottish Pale Ale Malt or call 1-800-374-2739. Chris, talk to me about your background in brewing and give me the quick story of Wolf's Ridge, how the brewery came to be, and how you all have grown to focus on the beers that you all do.
Yeah, definitely. So I think my move into craft beer is a lot like many others. I really, although in some ways not, so like I really wasn't much of a beer drinker at a young age. I really didn't drink a lot of alcohol, and I wasn't really drinking until I was 21. I'm really jealous of some of my team who got into brewing with Wolf's Ridge at the age of like 23, 24. I was over 30 by the time I was settled into, I had my 30th birthday like 2 days after getting started at Wolf's Ridge. In any case, I got into tasting beer and reviewing stuff on Beer Advocate back, before Untapped was even a thing. And home brewing, self-taught. I used to work a second shift job. And so I couldn't go to club meetings. And so I feel like I missed out a little bit there. But on the other hand, I kind of had to force myself to figure it out alone. And after a couple of years of doing that, I really decided I didn't like my day job and eventually took the first opening that presented itself to me, which was washing kegs at Columbus Brewing Company, who at the time, there were only like 5-ish breweries in Columbus, but they were the biggest and definitely the best, one of the best in the state. They've got a bunch of GABF medals for IPA and whatnot. And worked my way up from there. After a couple years, I wanted to go back to my roots of homebrewing and designing my own beers. And so an opportunity presented itself at Wolf's Ridge, who was looking for a head brewer who had, kind of a little bit more of a carte blanche role to make recipe changes and develop things. So in 2014, I started at Wolf's Ridge, and they're a family-owned brewery and restaurant. And when I started, it was just a 15-barrel brew house with 4 fermenters. And over the years, we grew that into 9 10, 11 fermenters, and 4 bright tanks, in our original location. We've got a full service restaurant, which is usually rated one of the best restaurants in the city. We beat out like the fine dining French restaurant that I proposed to my wife in even. So that's always kind of like nice. Like, oh, I just work there. You know, I get free food once in a while. And at the end of 2019, we moved into a production facility. And so we're still running both breweries, but we moved our larger tanks to the production facility. And now we're running a 3-vessel, 30-barrel specific brew house, and have 8 120-barrel fermenters, and then a few smaller ones as well, canning our beer now and whatnot. So that's kind of like the rough and dirty of it.
That's a nice arc where you got started thinking this is a small restaurant brew pub kind of approach to making a whole bunch of different, varying, creative beers. And the success of that has organically led to this kind of growth onto the production side. Were there, some key drivers on that production side, the beers that, through that kind of restaurant process of making things, trying things out, testing and, and being able to always produce new things that you found the audience particularly were drawn to?
Yeah. So, one of the things that in retrospect, I'm most pleased or proud of what we've accomplished at Wolf's Ridge all those years being a pub. The brewery's in the basement of this 100-year-old building. They had to cut the floor out just so the tops of the fermenters could kind of stick up a little bit, and it's windowed off from the seating in the restroom, restaurant. But we were really space constrained and challenged with just doing everything from barrel aging to getting pallets of grain or bottles down into that basement, finding a forklift that didn't like hit the ceiling and all of that. And early on, when we added our tap room, which is in the same building technically, but it's a separate room and separate space, the owners asked me how many tap handles we should put in, and we at the time had 12 on in the restaurant that were usually full of beer. That was usually all ours. And I decided let's get 20, and that was a lot with only 4 fermenters to try to fill 20 handles with our own beer at all times. But I made that my challenge, and one of the ways we filled them, which is a lot more common now than I think it was 5-7 years ago, was infusing, single kegs of a beer at a time just to fill the tab. And so that led to a ton of experimentation and ultimately led to a lot of our most popular beers, one of which is Daybreak, our coffee vanilla cream ale. That's actually our best selling beer. It outsells our IPA by like 30 or 40% most weeks. And it's just a really unique, beautiful beer. The original inspiration for that was Calm Before the Storm by Ballast Point. I was out in San Diego in 2015. I don't even think that beer was in a bottle at that point in time. And I had such a unique experience ordering that there. I thought I was ordering a stout when I read the description of the beer, and I probably just read it too quickly. And they handed me this golden beer, but they recognized me as a brewer, and so they told me it was free, and so I didn't want to send it back. So I'm like, I'll just drink it, whatever it is. I'll figure it out. I'm sure it's good. And then I realized, no, it was the beer I ordered. It's just golden in color, crystal clear. It's not dark. It's not black. And so I went home and tried to replicate it. And using, without knowing how they did theirs, we found our own way of doing it, which we can talk about. Since then, it's just a really unique beer that, people who aren't familiar with, you could call it a golden stout. I don't like using that term because it's not to me, it's not a real style, but it's just, it's a golden beer that kind of tastes like a stout. And even people who hate drinking black coffee or coffee with milk like drinking that beer. It's really strange. And so it has a wide appeal. It's fun to order at the bar and see people drink for the first time. So.
Sure. I agree with you on the whole golden stout thing. There's just something that I don't love about it, even though I understand principally describing the beer in terms of flavor rather than ingredient and process can make some sense to people, but generally the amount of roastiness on this is relatively low. It's there, it's just, but when you see, you got started and you were working on this kind of, keg infusion thing, on that brew pub scale, what does that look like, on that small scale? Did you have specific small 1 or 2 barrel tanks, or were you literally putting it into, corny kegs or something where you can pop it open and actually dose stuff into it.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we were doing. And I know a lot of your listeners are home brewers. And so obviously I made it work on a professional scale, but this would also be super easy to do on a home brewing scale. I will say up front, from a professional level, it can be extremely time consuming. We usually upcharge the pints of these infused beers by 50 cents, which isn't a lot, but over the course of 100 pints, it kind of justifies your labor. But sometimes it didn't. But it filled the line and people loved it. But we started with basically at the time, I wanted to do cask beer and we didn't have any casks. And so this was my way of finding a way to, because at Columbus Brewing Company, they were very driven by one or two brands of beer. It was like almost all IPA. And so the only time there was experimentation at that brewery was when they did casks for beer festivals. And so I wanted to emulate that at our bar, but money was really tight. We weren't, the owners didn't want to buy casks, but there were a bunch of old corny kegs from the owner's homebrewing days in the corner that had never been touched, at least as far as I was aware. And I'm like, well, I can put those to use. And so I used to clean them out, pop the top, and throw in a bag of coffee or citrus peel or something and rack the beer on top of it out of a half barrel. And we used to just do one at a time and maybe put it back into a 6-barrel or something. And as these started selling better and better, I was racking a half barrel into 3 corny kegs and then doing 2 half barrels at a time. And eventually that got obscene. And so when we had a little bit more money, then we're still using these today. They're Sabco, I think they're called like bright kegs. They're made to be like bright tanks or fermenters for homebrewers, but it's a half barrel keg. It's got a little PRV on it, and the keg spear is on a 4-inch tri-clamp. And so it's a really wide opening compared to a corny keg. I think you can even get these in like 20-liter or 6-barrel size as well. But nevertheless, it's a lot of room to put stuff in there. And so, yeah, we'll, maybe toast some coconut and throw that in there. And usually within 1 to 3 days, you've got your flavor at the ratios we were going at. And then you just rack it back into a keg and tap it at the bar. The fun thing with that, if you're only doing it for your bar, we're not too worried about re-fermentation. And so we'll put whole fruit in there and all kinds of things that I wouldn't do if I was going to bottle it. We have done for a membership club and some other very small specific releases, infused beer in those Sabco Brights for like a mini bottle release. And as long as it's not something that's going to re-ferment, then we can again port it into a keg, and we have a little 2-head filler that does our bombers that will run off those as well. So, but yeah, that's basically the process.
That's cool. Let's talk about what I was going to say. I love watching this proliferation of small scale stainless that was initially designed to allow homebrewers to have gear that felt more like pro brewers gear. I've watched it kind of proliferate back into professional brew houses, and everyone from Allagash to Firestone Walker have, small stainless, whether it's Blickman or SS or Spike or Stout or any of these, smaller tank manufacturers. It's amazing just how many of these like half barrel, 1-barrel, 2-barrel, fermentation vessels or unitanks or whatever, like now fully plumbed with glycol and everything, in order to it's amazing how good the tech is now. But that same kind of spirit of experimentation has found its way back into, even these larger production brew houses in that same kind of way. You mentioned earlier talking about trying to kind of reverse engineer or create an idea of for Daybreak. I want to talk about that. But first, a brewery might have 99 problems, but your fruit supplier shouldn't be one. Old Orchard is already known for their quality concentrates, but they also pride themselves on consistent product and reliable supply. When brewers need assistance, Old Orchard is just an email, phone call, or even a text away. Based in Greater Grand Rapids, Michigan, better known as Beer City, USA, Old Orchard is core to the brewing community. To join their fruit family, learn more at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, for years, Brewery DB has been the industry's only professionally curated source of brewery and beer information. In 2019, over 1 million brewery visits were made by craft fans searching for breweries on brewerydb.com. In just a few weeks, Brewery DB will unveil an all-new experience to help craft lovers get back on the brewery trail. To take full advantage of the enhanced unsurpassed marketing power of BreweryDB and increase your taproom traffic. Set up your account on marketmybrewery.com. That's marketmybrewery.com. It's easy and it's free. So, Chris, talk to me about this process of having this beer that inspired you, and then wanting to create something that wasn't just a carbon copy of it, but was your own expression of it, and then figuring out how to get these flavors that are so associated with darker, richer, roasty beers into such a light and delicate kind of cream ale base.
Yeah, so I guess we were somewhat fortunate that one of our core beers at the time was called Clear Sky, and that was just a straight 5% American cream ale that we already sold quite a bit of. So we always kind of had that in the tank, and it is such a great blank canvas for infusing flavors. It's a beer we're not canning right now. It used to be a core brand and kind of got replaced a year and a half ago, but we still brew it as the base for a ton of variants that go into cans to this day. So we started with that base, and again, we've got this great restaurant upstairs. So I ran upstairs and just grabbed a handful of coffee that they had under the bar. Turns out, because they're using really great ingredients, local where possible. They were using coffee from a local Columbus roaster called One Line Coffee, who, at least in my opinion, I found to be one of the best roasters in the country. Definitely what I would consider the best coffee roaster in Columbus or Ohio that I've experienced. And so I was already starting with a really great ingredient. And again, kind of going back on my knowledge from my time at Columbus Brewing Company, they at the time, and I don't know if this is how they do their stout to this day, but at the time they were doing a seasonal coffee stout, and they were doing a coarse grind on the coffee and putting it into the bright tank. And so I thought, I'll do a coarse grind on this and throw it into the keg, the corny keg like we just talked about. I didn't know how to use the grinder that they had up in the restaurant. So I thought, I'll put it through, there's a little homebrew grain mill down in the basement, and it was just getting stuck in there. It wasn't getting crushed. And so that didn't work. And so ultimately, I couldn't figure out how to crush the coffee. So I just threw it in. And when the beer came back out, I was surprised at how much coffee flavor there was without having crushed it. And so we kind of just kept pushing that envelope a little bit down the line and doing it again and again and refining how much coffee and this and that. But ultimately, we've done different experiments where we did an event where we did coffee paired side by side with the beer it went into. We've done multiple of those, and one of which we did a coarse grind, a fine grind, a cold brew, and a whole bean, and the same base beer, same coffee origin and everything side by side in a flight, and everyone got to try those. And they were all drastically different. And my favorite leading into that and coming back out was the whole bean approach, which is what we're doing to this day.
That's fascinating to me. How would you describe, if you can dive back into that sense memory, how would you describe the difference between, varying grinds of coffee and the way that they expressed in that beer?
So I think the biggest one is between the whole bean and the coarse ground. The coarse ground, it is a little bit more intense of a flavor, and so a little bit coffee is going to go a little bit further if you grind it. You're going to get a little bit stronger or intense of a character, but I think it's also a little bit of a harsher, more astringent character. And some of that may just come down to dosing rates. We did equal dosing rates and everything as best we could, and even for the approximation with the cold brew. But I find the whole bean to be a softer. I just always describe it to people as how a bag of uncrushed coffee beans smells versus coffee grounds or coffee in your cup. It's just something different about that bag of untouched beans. It's the purest form of what that coffee can smell like to some extent. The cold brew was really delicious as well. Again, it's kind of a different level of intensity. It does add color to the beer, even in a small quantity. And we wanted this bright golden, not to look like it was touched by anything dark at all. And so that's one of the reasons why we've stuck with the whole bean. But I still kind of personally preferred it. Interesting, our coffee roaster preferred the most intense versions of it. So the finely ground or the cold brew were their favorites. But I prefer the softer, more nuanced whole bean approach and character that we get in Daybreak.
That's really interesting. And so even when conditioning this on that whole bean coffee, you really don't get any color extraction through that.
No, if there is, it's imperceptible to the naked eye. I've never sent it to a lab to try to really see, but again, we would always historically have regular clear sky on a flight next to Daybreak and maybe other variants as well, and we never had any noticeable color pickup from that whole bean. So.
In terms of time and temperature, do you all talk about, like, I'm curious what that looks like. Aiding extraction, obviously warmer temperatures tend to boost that, cooler temperatures, tamp it down. Is there a kind of, and you also are obviously in a production environment, you want to move beer through at a reasonable speed, through this brew house process. What does that look like for you all?
Yeah, so what we've come around to, well, I guess firstly, we do it in the bright tank, or we did it in the keg, which basically was a bright tank. So it's always going into finished beer. And we've worked it out to £1 per barrel for at least a lighter beer as the starting point. Anything less than that, and it's going to need either more time or it's going to be a much softer character. And we sometimes will go a little bit higher depending on the beer or our beans. If it's a really light roast heavy blend or origin that's going in there, we might use a little bit more. Usually for at least Daybreak, it's about 3 days. So 3 days whole bean, £1 per barrel in the bright tank. And what we've kind of determined is, even though it's cold, you've got the acidity of the beer, the pressure of being in the bright tank, the alcohol is a really good solvent. And really all we want are the oils on those beans or within those beans. And so I think that's enough to extract those precious aromatic oils without adding color that you're going to get from crushing a bean and going in there. There's sugars and carbons and things in those beans once you crush them that is also going to add to either color and or flavor. So it's one of the other benefits of not crushing it, I think.
Are there any other recipe considerations that you make to your normal cream ale in order to, help the kind of coffee, express in the way that you want it to?
No. So again, this was all the infusions we used to do were just existing beers, and I wanted it to be a recipe that was brewed to be its purest form. And so similar to how we work with barrels, I want it to be a good tasting beer on its own before you throw adjuncts at it or throw it into a barrel. And so we just wanted it to be the most classic cream ale that, to our taste, it's about 40% corn in that recipe, and then just some pale malt for the most part, and really low IBUs, Willamette hops in that recipe. So it just works really well. But that method works great. That's the same way we do it in our Imperial Stout. We might use a darker roast or an espresso roast for the stout, or maybe more beans, but same amount of time, largely the same ratio and process, and we're getting just as good coffee extraction there.
So with Daybreak, also vanilla is your other ingredient in that. Talk to me about using vanilla to kind of, highlight and also can, further soften some of that kind of coffee flavor and sweetness.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I think this may have come from trying to replicate Calm Before the Storm. There's a lot of beers like this now, and some have lactose, some may not have vanilla, while others do, things like that. But we found that the vanilla and real vanilla, so our preference is Madagascar Bourbon vanilla, and it adds a perceived sweetness to the beer. And one of the great things about Daybreak and all of our cream ale variants is they drink like a beer. They're not sickly sweet. They may smell sweet or they may smell savory from cinnamon or something, but they drink really clean and dry. They're fermented out. And so that's one of the things I love, that the vanilla lends that perception of sweetness without actually being sweet on the palate. And we've experimented with vanilla pastes, and I think I tried to extract once or twice in a pinch because the vanilla shortage, 4 years ago was like really, really bad. It's still not necessarily easy or cheap to use real vanilla, but it's a lot easier now than it once was for me. But nothing really kind of to my palate compared to real vanilla. It's a less intense character, and so some people don't always pick it up. But even if you don't know it's there, I think it's doing something to the beer. And real vanilla is kind of like the secret weapon, where it makes almost any beer taste better. It really does. But you obviously can't afford to put it in every beer.
No, we with some another Ohio brewery, when I was talking to Brett Coleman Baker from Urban Artifact, he has the same exact approach with their fruit beers. That it's and the amount is so small. It's so interesting to see that what you might perceive as sub threshold, in terms of amount of vanilla added, can just provide that extra little twist. And I love that idea of highlighting, creating the perception of something without overdoing, or without creating that actual thing. And these beers, we find it over and over again, those beers that present themselves as potentially being sweet without actually being sweet, are that beautiful trick that allows that to create drinkability in something that where if it were actually that sweet, just wouldn't lend itself to that second or third pint in that kind of drinking situation. So no, that's a really fun approach. Do you have, using that cream ale base, do you have other treatments beyond Daybreak where you take it and and push other ingredients?
Yeah, so probably the most popular one is called Cinnamon Toast Brunch. And so
pastry cream ale, okay.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's trying to replicate the flavor of Cinnamon Toast Crunch cereal, obviously. But all of our variants are using, again, whole, real ingredients. And so we're not dumping cereal into the mash or anything like that. But I think it gets really, really close. And so in this case, all it is Daybreak plus cinnamon. And we only use Vietnamese cinnamon. It's really a sweet and I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. Almost like savory. It doesn't lend the same kind of like Christmas candle character that some other types of cinnamon sometimes can. But that just the simple addition of cinnamon completely changes the beer. Like, you really have to think about it to detect that there's coffee in there. The interplay of coffee, vanilla, and cinnamon makes it taste more like this cinnamon graham crackery kind of character, which is really beautiful. We just released a variant called strawberry basil. And so there's a bunch of strawberry puree that gets fermented out in the fermenter, and then vanilla and fresh basil leaves in the bright tank. And it's a really beautiful beer, again, that smells jammy and fruity up front, but when you drink it, it's dry and clean and herbaceous and really lovely. And then there's a million other variants, but there's like a lemon meringue and a creamsicle, but they're all just like fruit or spices plus cream ale. There's really no like gimmick with most of them there.
One question that pops to my mind: wow, a lot of contemporary breweries are exploring these kinds of flavor approaches in the context of tart and kettle soured beers. Why approach it through this kind of quote unquote, I don't even want to call it clean beer, but not sour or more typical traditional cream ale base, versus something like a kettle sour base?
So, like we were, I guess you could say we were late to the game in making kettle sours. We were making barrel aged mixed fermentation sours for 3 years before we brewed our first kettle sour. And I guess, we started playing around with Clear Sky in the end of 2014 or beginning of 2015, which does not predate kettle sours as a trend, but it predates it as like an explosive trend. Most people weren't making them. I don't know if there was a single brewery in Columbus I could reliably find a quick sour or kettle sour at. 5-6 years ago. So that's probably part of it. Again, part of it is I was working with what I had. So I was starting with 4 15-barrel tanks and filling 20 taps. And so I was just looking to infuse existing brands that I already had kegs of, because we didn't have a smaller pilot system or tiny tanks to work with. And again, it's this, the cream ale is such a perfect canvas to showcase flavor without anything else. Like, you're almost getting almost nothing from the beer other than drinkability. And so there's no acidity there. There's no sweetness, or whatever else that you might get from other, types of styles that, might interact uniquely with these ingredients. But, like, it's just pure ingredient, I think, to some extent when we do it this way.
Right. And beer is already acidic, so what you're talking about, even with kettle sours, can be, dropping it down by 1.5, pH, and you can certainly achieve some of that adding acidity just by adding fruit in order to, because that
That's very
fruit
true.
often brings its own acidity to it. And it is a funny thing that kettle sours today are generally, a lot of brewers are trying to dial pH in closer to that pH of the fruit so that it feels and tastes that way that they expect it. No, but I'm just curious about that. But it makes sense, and and that's certainly a rational approach to that. Since you started talking about barrel aged beers, I definitely want to kind of move the conversation in that direction. Before we do, ABS Commercial is excited to be a part of today's podcast. ABS is a full brewery outfitter offering brewhouses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts. As a part of ABS Commercial's ongoing give back campaign, they'll be giving away an ABS Keg Viking keg washer in June. So make sure to periodically check the ABS Commercial Facebook page and find out when the contest opens up and how to enter to win a Keg Viking. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about your barrel aged beer program. Talk to me a little bit about how you got your start doing that, what you led you into it, and how you found the kind of voice for your barrel program. Because from the beers that I've tasted, there definitely is a particular point of view to the way that you all approach barrel aged beers that I wouldn't say that it's uncommon, but it's just very, consistent, and you follow this approach in a very reasonable way. So talk to me a little bit about how you got started with that and how you kind of built a direction for that program.
Yeah, so one of the number one things I really wanted to work with as I got into the professional side of the industry was barrel aging. Right before I got hired at Columbus Brewing, I had purchased a little 10-gallon rum barrel to put some homebrewed stout into. And from there, I was always pestering them, like, when are we going to buy barrels? Like, can I be the one to fill them? And they did a little bit of that at the time. They're doing a lot more now. But when I moved to Wolfridge, again, it was kind of like, we don't have a lot of money right now. Like, we can get some barrels here and there. But it was kind of intermittent. But finally, we kind of took the plunge and bought a handful of used bourbon barrels from Watershed, who's a local distillery. And again, it was kind of just an opportunity based on the restaurant poured their bourbon and they're 2 miles away and there's no shipping. And we know they're ultra fresh and they're in really good shape. They haven't been shipped and beaten up. And so for years, those were reliable as barrels because they didn't leak and, they didn't cause issues and they were cheaper than ordering from a broker or something.
And you guys are so close to Kentucky. Well, not so close, but you're reasonably close, a couple hour drive down to where most bourbon is made. So it gives you as you wanted to expand that, I imagine you had some more options at your fingertips.
Yeah. So, we started off largely only aging our Imperial Stout Direwolf, which is a kind of a core beer. We have it around most of the year. And that's been 80% of what's gone into a barrel on the clean side for us over the years. And again, it's just a really great base beer. And so that's where the consistency comes in a lot of ways. But pretty early on, I started experimenting, getting rum barrels and brandy barrels, apple brandy barrels, etc. We filled, a huge gamut by now. Some of the things I'm most excited for, looking forward to next year or later this year, Armagnac and cognac barrels and some mixed finish barrels and things like that. But just having a couple, 2 or 3 beers that are really delicious on their own and that are big enough, robust enough, sweet enough, bitter enough. I think that balance of everything is really important. So it's maybe a little bit more of an old school approach. We were talking beforehand about the difference between kind of like Direwolf, which I would consider a fairly thick and sweet beer, at least for my palate, but then modern imperial stouts are often, 5 or more points of finishing gravity, sweeter and fuller bodied than Direwolf might be. And for my palate, it's almost like too sweet sometimes. And so I like that, like more restrained, balanced beer that's got sweetness, but bitterness, alcohol, that helps it age better. And we started doing sours about a year later. This is something else I really wanted to do. But it was like, well, we can buy some wine barrels for sours or we can buy bourbon barrels for stout. And like, well, the stout's going to sell better. It's more exciting. Like we can't not do bourbon barrel stout. So what I started doing was basically retiring the barrels from the clean program into our sour program. And so in an ideal world, we probably would have just bought fresh wine barrels every time. But every time I emptied Direwolf barrels, they went to the other side of our basement, and we brewed beer intentionally to become sour. So we weren't pulling beer off of a tank. We were brewing more dextrinous wort with lower hopping rates and, different thought process going into it, and then fermenting in the barrel like it's a mini fermenter. And we've grown that. I've got some pictures on my phone where we've got like 5 barrels with a bunch of plastic wrap trying to like house them in. So like if the fermentation sprayed everywhere, it wouldn't be contaminating.
Don't affect everything else, right?
Yeah, and now we've got about 100 barrels down there, just stacked on top of each other. Like you can barely move in that basement now, and I can't retire anymore because we're pretty much out of space. But it's now developed into this big program where we're looking at creating really cool blends and things like that, and the beer is sitting long enough to get nice and funky. So those are kind of the two sides of our barrel aging program right now: the wild and the clean.
Sure. Let's talk about the clean side now. You mentioned that with Direwolf that the core of this, is the same way it is with Daybreak, is a beer that stands alone, and a beer that, a well-made beer that you can drink before it's put into a barrel. That's a strategy that we see a lot of brewers diverging on. Today there are a lot of brewers going the other direction and brewing beers that are not intended to be drunk on their own, where they are simply going to be either blending components, they are ultra high gravity, or they are just very excessively sweet. And they are built for this kind of long-term, long haul aging, especially as we start seeing aging times in barrels extend out past the 2-year mark.
Yeah.
Creating a beer that can even live that long in a barrel is its own kind of technical feat. But you seem to, be drawn to that other direction where, that same beer needs to be a very drinkable thing now. That changes the kind of structure, the approach to actual barreling, or it must, in terms of time, and other things. Talk to me a little bit about, what that recipe looks like and then how you think about that recipe in terms of the amount of time that it'll also spend in a barrel, and then what, of course, how you kind of taste through that and make some of these determinations about when beers are done and ready.
I guess in its own way, Direwolf has proven itself to handle age in a barrel and in a bottle very well. We just opened an unbarrel aged bottle of Direwolf from 2015 recently, and it was beautiful. But we've done 2 or 3 double barrel projects with that beer now. That it's about a year in each barrel, so 2 years or so total, and it's coming out great. But it's a beer that is layered. A lot of people build recipes to be simple, and this is kind of like, if you want your recipe simple, this beer recipe probably would give you a heart attack. There's probably like 16 different malts in there, maybe more.
Geez, Chris, you have a homebrew recipe that you're making at a commercial
pretty
scale.
much. Yeah. But, just layering all kinds of different caramels and things. A longish boil. It's not a really long boil, but it's like a 2.5 hour boil, and 50, 60 IBUs. So not crazy, but high enough, higher than probably what some people are doing now. And it finishes around 10 or 11 Plato on average. So it's not by any means like lacking body, but it's not crazy. So that's kind of the structure going into the barrel. And we try to give it a minimum of 12 months. It tastes pretty good at 8, but usually I prefer it at 12. And now we're getting a little bit longer. The pandemic helped a little bit with that, with slowing down things. And so like 14, 16 months is like, I like this even better. But for like, as far as brewing things more intended to go right into a barrel or maybe aging longer, now that we're getting bigger and, we've got a little bit more money to play around with in the barrel program, we're starting to brew some new recipes that are a little bit stronger, a little bit higher finishing gravity. And I've definitely seen where some brewers talk about like blending, like brewing like a super dry and a super sweet, and then finding a blend after the fact. And I really love that approach. We just haven't really had a lot of capability to like build that yet. But that's one of those things I'm looking forward to playing around with in the future.
Marty from Revolution was talking about that on the podcast a while back, that their, like 20 Plato finishing gravity thrown into barrels just has a different aging character to it and makes for, it's never something you never want to drink by itself, but thrown into the blend, it adds, that nice kind of component. It's just interesting to talk about. But I can't let this 16 malt thing go without asking you about like how and why, you've built such a layered difficult now, and of course the production brewers have to hate you for this.
Yeah.
Because that's got to be a terrible brew day when you're, if you're using that many malts, then you're opening and measuring out, potentially from some of the bags, which is never a fun process. But talk to me about going through and your kind of thought process in building such a difficult and extensive kind of recipe for this stout base.
Sure. Some of it is trying to include like a pretty wide gamut of flavors. And so, the base is kind of split between Maris Otter and Weyermann Barca Vienna malt. It used to be predominantly Maris Otter, but over the years we've used the Barca line of malts a lot, and they have a nice rounder, sweeter character to them, and they tend to get a better extract. And so it's kind of that combined element where it went from being like 2 or 3 bags in as like a portion of something to being like half of the base malt. There's a ton of oats in there. So right there's 3 malts. There's roasted barley, chocolate rye, pale chocolate, and they're all just, I'm getting different flavors from all these different things. Some of it I'm thinking about color, some of it I'm thinking about the roastiness or head color. So roasted barley's in there mostly just so the head is darker. So there's plenty enough other malts in there to give it a black color to the beer itself. And we used to double mash this beer. So on our pub system, I really wanted as strong and viscous of a wort as I could get. And so we would brew, fill our 15-barrel mash tun to almost overflowing, and then rack off about 10 barrels of wort, and then empty that, and then do another mash, and then fill up the kettle to 20 barrels pre-boil. With the second mash. And so having the 2 mashes, each mash was slightly different. And so it wasn't quite as onerous, I guess, at that point in time, where it wasn't 15 malts in one mash. It was more like 10 or 11, and some differences between the two. But now in our big system, it's kind of just all thrown in together. It's been refined over the years. There may be a little bit less than what we started with, as some malts have come and gone, or we've learned some things. But yeah, it's definitely a complicated beer.
And then, in terms of like caramel malts in the middle of that, obviously I'm counting, you got to have some in there, or many multiples of there. I'm curious how you can balance out those stronger, darker malt flavors with some of those, kind of mid-tone malts, and don't just kind of blow over completely, to the point where, they wouldn't matter in the beer.
So I spent a lot of time like really digging into the malts that were available and the flavors they were supposed to give off, and tasting things, and really kind of coming into deciding like what flavors I really enjoy and want to layer in. So there's a biscuit and aromatic malt, but I've come to only want those from Dingemans. I've tried several other maltsters and I don't like it quite as much, and so kind of like, I maybe could have gotten rid of one or both of those depending on which maltster it was, if it wasn't my preferred maltster. There's some 77, and there's a Carabohemian in there, which I think is a really beautiful malt. Some C120, and which really could probably go away, because we're also now using Simpson's DRC, which is different, but also similar in at least color profile. But they're all kind of just lending their own little element. The DRC's like got some of those like dark fruit notes that a 120 might have, but it's also got some roasty coffee notes to it, which is really delicious. So it's just trying to layer all that in there, and whether or not it's like necessary, I guess, is up to interpretation. But it's creating definitely a complex beer that I think you almost get more of that character from the barrel aged version of this beer than fresh. Fresh, it's also pretty like bitter, and hoppy up front. But as it ages out, like all this starts mellowing into that caramel toffee, fudge kind of character that you might be missing in fresh direwolf.
Interesting. So when it's 5 years old with this 2015 kind of approach to it, what direction, how does it taste at that kind of age point? Because most of these bigger imperial stouts, unadjuncted, that will drink that start getting that old, definitely start tilting kind of Belgian-y in flavor with dark fruits, dark red fruits, in particular. For you, how does that kind of layered caramel approach kind of push this beer over that much time?
So you definitely do get a little bit more of that dark fruit, but not excessively. That particular bottle, the recipe has changed a little bit over, all these years. And so it doesn't completely represent what the beer is now. We used to brew it to 9.3% and now we brew it to 10.8%. But it's still surprising the amount of like chocolate and roast that's present in that beer. I think it's the alcohol feels less intense, or more smoothed out over time as well.
What is, as you're making some of these brewing decisions over time, how does that decision-making process go for you? How do how's your process of kind of review and editing, with some of this core things like a beer like Dire Wolf go? Where's that moment where you say, maybe I should take this malt out or try this other malt, or maybe we should bump the ABV up a little bit, and maybe that's, what does that process look like for you? Are other people involved? Is that just you tasting? Do you take a deliberate kind of review approach to it? Do you brew tests and then, see how those kind of one-off test batches, work out, and then make some decisions about how you move forward? What does that kind of iterative process look like for you in Wolf's Ridge?
I think it's definitely a combination of different things. So some of the changes have been dictated by supply of ingredients. So I used to be a huge fan of Patagonia coffee malt, and I used to have that in pretty much every dark beer that we brewed. And now you can't get that anymore. The other coffee malts, which are often called brown malts out there, I don't think are anything close to what that beer malt was. So we still use the brown malt in Direwolf, but I don't like it nearly as much. And so I'm kind of looking for a substitute that will get me closer to what I used to get from that coffee malt, which was really not super dark, but like it had that roasted coffee flavor, but not adding a ton of color. So I didn't feel bad about putting a couple bags of it in there on top of the other roasted grains that we had. Where a lot of this brown malt, it looks like a chocolate malt, more often than not. So that's been a change that kind of was forced on us. The ABV has been boosted just kind of based on the continued barrel aging of the beer, but also just consumer trends. I feel like people want a slightly stronger beer, and I don't know how it ages in a barrel or over time, notwithstanding. I don't know if people would take Direwolf quite as seriously if it was only 9% in this day and age, so, even almost 11% is still kind of low for a lot of big imperial stouts that go into barrels these days. So that was one of those changes that I think just made sense for the beer and for the consumer.
Helps it stand up to some of the other adjunct flavors that you throw into there too, and and kind of keep the beer script going. As you taste malts, and evaluate malts, do you have a process around that? Do you steep them or make them teas, or you just chewing and tasting, or and how do you? What's that discovery process look like? Is this something where you're running to CBC and tasting some new things that folks are putting out there, or what does that sampling process look like for you?
Yeah, so we're not super scientific about it, but yeah, it's mostly chewing it and then just kind of really trying to think about where does this fit in? Is it already a style or flavor covered in one of our existing suppliers? Do we need to add someone? I definitely enjoy trying new things. I enjoy trying the local malts at conferences, and if I'm at CBC, I'm trying a lot of different things, but we use so many different brands as it is. I try to mitigate that as much as I can. But if there's something that's really delicious, We didn't use a lot from Patagonia. We tried several different things. There was a C35 I really loved that they had, but other than that, it was mostly that coffee. But like I was, willing to bring Patagonia into the brewery because I loved the flavor that malt had so much.
Everyone seems to love the Patagonia Extra Pale Malt also.
That was a good one too.
Right, right. Another big component with this Direwolf program is adding adjuncts and flavors to that. Obviously, it's something that you do even, with light beers like Daybreak. But talk to me a little bit about how you build, ideas for flavor combinations in Direwolf, and then, how that process may be similar or different, to how you also do that with Daybreak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of times it's just starting with an idea of a flavor that we want to get out of the beer, and then trying to backwards engineer like how we would do that our way with our given constraints. The first time we ever put like peanuts into Direwolf, we called it like a peanut butter stout, but we weren't using peanut butter at the time. I wasn't really aware of like the dried peanut flours that are easy to get or more easy to get now. And so we just roasted unsalted peanuts ourselves. I think anytime you add heat to spices or nuts and whatnot, you're bringing oils out, and you're going to get a more full flavor. We've seen that is a really big deal with coconut. If it's not roasted, you can barely taste it. And just crushing those up and putting it in the beer. We called it peanut butter Direwolf, and that was kind of our approximation at the time. It's not the same as most peanut beers, but that I felt good about it, and it tasted great. But it tastes like peanuts. You start layering in vanilla, and then that gets you a little bit closer. I would maybe now, if I was replicating that same beer, put a little bit of cacao and maybe not even say it's in there, because instead of calling it a chocolate peanut butter, but just finding the right cacao in a smaller quantity might help add, again, another layer and perception of sweetness or smoothness that would make you think peanut butter. That's usually kind of how I approach it if it's a common flavor. Otherwise, it's thinking through also like what's safe to put in the beer, and how are we going to process it and handle it? How are we going to add it to the beer, and trying to be strategic about that before we go to do it. Because we've been caught with our pants down, so to speak, in the past, where we're working with a weird ingredient that we're like, I didn't think this through. This is dumb. The first time we wanted to do like a big marshmallow beer, we thought if you boiled it, you'd boil off any flavor. And so what's the point? And we didn't want to just get a picture of it. And so we got marshmallow fluff, and we decided to basically make a giant, like multiple kegs of chocolate milk. We also had this like really expensive cocoa powder that someone in our kitchen recommended. And we added hot water, and we're trying to stir this shit up. And it's like the stickiest mess you've ever seen in your life. And we're pumping this into a tank now. And so I would never do it that way again. But yeah, trying to think it through is also a big key component. Yeah.
Are there any other curious or interesting solutions that you found to add those adjuncts into beer in a way that meets the expectation, but doesn't create a giant, ridiculous mess? I'm just thinking, a few weeks ago, I was talking to Marcus Baskerville of Weathered Souls, and he was mentioning their marshmallow. They use marshmallow powder, and that was their marshmallow solution around that. Are there any of these other kinds of solutions that you've found that create a fun adjunct flavor without some of the mess?
Yeah. Cinnamon is kind of like a secret weapon in a lot of ways. We did a more recent peanut butter stout that we did. It was a collaboration with Listerman Brewing and Lil Beaver out in Chicago, and we called it Man Beaver Wolf. But that one I did use peanut flour in because I didn't want to deal with toasting nuts at the time for the size of the batch. But we layered a little bit of cinnamon in there to just add an extra dimension to the beer. It wasn't really a strong characteristic. There's cinnamon in most things that I want like a graham crackery character to. I know you can get like crumbled graham graham crackers. I don't know if it's just called graham, but like we've tried it before, but it's like a powder, and it's a mess, and it kind of like dissolves into your beer. So even if you put it in a bag, I kind of don't like how it actually like works in the beer. So cinnamon, usually at least in a lower quantity, kind of gives you that graham type of flavor. So there's quite a few beers that we layer cinnamon in that way.
Just the idea of cinnamon creates it's been baked kind of
Yeah, definitely.
crusty idea to it. No, that's an interesting one, almost like using vanilla at that low threshold level,
Hmm.
just to kind of put a point on it. Now, do you mention the ingredient? And this is something I always find interesting, that brewers feel compelled to talk about everything that they throw into a beer, almost as if the more things that you've thrown into it, the better. But you mentioned earlier of using cacao, but also potentially not talking about it, because every time you mention something that's in there, it creates an expectation in the mind of the consumer that they should be able to taste it. And so naturally, if you say this is a such and such beer with peanuts and cinnamon, people was like, well, I really get the nuts, but I don't really taste the cinnamon in that. And then, of course, you've created an expectation that you
Hmm.
haven't fulfilled, even if the point is, to use that ingredient in a small way to highlight something else. When I go out and sit down at a restaurant and order a dish, like, no chef is going to tell me every single fucking spice that they put into that thing. And I don't expect that to be on the menu. I expect to, taste something that is a beautiful creation and a thoughtful creation from the mind of someone who knows how to work with all of these flavors and ingredients to create something that I'm going to enjoy. And so from your perspective as a brewer, just how do you balance that kind of customer expectation versus wanting to also be truthful in labeling? It's
Yeah.
not necessarily an easy question to answer.
Yeah, it is tough. We tend to err on the side of listing more than not listing. Part of that is because food is such a huge part of what Wilsridge does. I try to be very aware of like food allergies, and so like anything with nuts, we actually have a little red emblem that says contains real nuts that we put on all of our labels of beers that get nuts. Just because I have an ex-brewer that worked for us that was hyper allergic to peanuts, and one of our owners is allergic to tree nuts, and so I try to always be aware of that. And so it's like there's always a little bit of a fear, like if I don't tell you, like is that a problem for somebody? Like we used to, for our kettle sours, grow up yogurt cultures, and then I didn't think twice about it. Like I was just reading about how well it worked for some people, and I kind of like the profile. And then one day someone told me like, well, does your label say that it contains lactose? I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no lactose in this beer. I'm like, well, didn't you use yogurt? I'm like, well, it's like a tiny, tiny amount of yogurt for a huge amount of beer. It's not like we intentionally added lactose, but there's technically trace amounts in there. I'm like, maybe I should disclose that. I don't know, but we definitely often do get bit where, another secret weapon cinnamon beer this Christmas, we did a beer called Cosmo Canyon that was a cranberry. We called it a cranberry sauce Berliner Weiss. And the primary flavor was orange peel and cranberry puree. But we did add cinnamon to kind of, again, just tie it together. And I felt like that would give it a little extra oomph towards the cranberry sauce kind of character, even though cranberry sauce usually doesn't use cinnamon. But a lot of people were like, I love this beer, but like needs more cinnamon. I'm like, well, wasn't the point. So maybe I shouldn't have put it on there. It can be a struggle. And I feel like I want to use, like, maybe be more diligent about not putting stuff on there if it doesn't have to be. If it's not real obvious, kind of just like when you're entering beer in competition, we've definitely been bit the same way where like, I feel like, oh, like, it is in there. So I'll list it. But then of course, like if a judge can't taste it, then they ding you for it. So.
And I agree with you. I don't mean violating any food safety
For
regulations, because I definitely think in terms of food safety, every potential allergen absolutely, should be listed. It's the ethical, moral thing to do. And I think it's just something the entire industry needs to do to avoid it becoming a federally regulated thing pushed down on us. And I say that because both of my kids have food allergies. One has just recently been diagnosed as celiac. The other is deathly allergic to peanuts and tree nuts and shellfish, and so it's something that we live with on a daily concern, reading labels, being very careful about this kind of thing. And so you're right, it is a delicate balance. We're not talking about those things. If there are people who cannot consume lactose, cannot consume other ingredients, like, yes, you should absolutely list those, so that consumers can make an informed choice. But you're, like if you're using a small amount of, hint of a spice of some sort or another, or in this case, using vanilla, in order to highlight something, something that people are not allergic to, just seems like, brewers, and I'm guilty of it too, because, we're, as we are evaluating and, and going, pushing beers in front of our blind panel, we always wrestle with that idea. Do we talk about every special ingredient? Do we list everything there? Or do we try to, approach it from that other direction and let the tasters taste and see how that matches up with the expectation that a brewer might create with their own marketing. And so we've done it both ways. It's fascinating to see what people taste when they are not given that kind of suggestion or told what those special ingredients are. Sometimes things are obvious, sometimes they're not. But anyway, that's kind of interesting. Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned before that you've got a barrel aged kind of traditional sour beer program, making mixed fermentation beers. Generally taking a relatively low acid approach to this, and and now that side of the brewing program has been able to grow. You've also received some accolades for it with some medals at FoBAB. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of how that program has evolved and your philosophy, and then technique around building beers for that kind of sour barrel aging, mixed culture barrel aging.
Yeah, so the very first barrels that we filled were Flanders Red, and at the time I knew I was going to give it a lot of age. Like I said, we kind of just took some ex-Direwolf barrels and brewed the Flanders into it and kind of forgot about it for a while. And finally, I was being really diligent about thinking this beer needs to come out of the barrel. We've got a little bit more space now. We expanded into the other half of the basement in the building that we were renting in our downtown location. And I was tasting it. It tastes about ready. It's starting to get pretty tart. It had been about a year and a half or so. And I figured let's pop the bung. Maybe we can get a cool pellicle shot to post on Instagram or whatever. And I realized that over a third of the barrel had evaporated in those 3 or 5 barrels, whatever it was. And I was like, holy cow, I need to get the beer out of here now. I didn't realize it was quite so bad. And so from there, we moved pretty hard into developing, our own sour, more of a program. We brought in a horizontal bright tank, which is the only kind of, stainless vessel that we could actually fit in the low ceilings of that side of our basement, dedicated pump and all kinds of tri-clamp fittings and everything. They're all marked with pink tape. And then as we added more and more barrels, being aware of, because they were ex-Direwolf barrels, there was sometimes still spirit flavor left in them. And bourbon in a Saison is not necessarily a super cohesive flavor pairing. And you never knew. Sometimes you'd never know it was a bourbon barrel after it on the first fill after Direwolf, and then other times it was pretty intense. And early on, we didn't have enough blending stock to really do much with it if it got intense. So actually, the very first batch of Terre de Sauvage Green that we brewed, that's our dry hopped mixed fermentation sour, or we used to call it a Saison. We've kind of moved on from calling it a Saison because of the implications there. But at about 2 months, I decided to dump it because it was so overwhelmingly bourbon forward. And I'm not sure exactly why, especially that batch. My brewer at the time, Lewis, was kind of horrified, and he was really upset for several days. You're dumping all this beer. It tastes good. It's just a lot of bourbon. Let's blend it. I'm it's going to take us a year to blend this out. Let's just start again. We just racked right on top of the yeast cake, and so we didn't have to buy more yeast or anything. I guess one of the owners didn't even realize I had done it until a year or two later, and he was like, "What? You never told me you dumped." It was 5 or 7 barrels worth of beer, but it was the right call. The next batch, after like 2 or 3 months, we got it out of the barrel, and that was our first gold medal at FoBAB. And so we designed that series of beers a little more low acid. It was all soured with lactobacillus, no pediococcus, because I didn't want ropiness. I didn't want to worry about diacetyl. And we thought like, oh, we're going to turn and burn these beers in 3 months. Well, between like the speed that they actually sell, because mixed fermentation beer does not sell as fast as stout or barrel aged stout or IPA or kettle sours and everything else. And the amount of work it took to like handle those beers, we couldn't run it through our normal bottling machine or anything. It just started aging longer and longer, but it's producing better beer now because of it. But yeah, now it's just there's several different red beers in there, a lot of different like grain bills. We're using a lot more heritage grains. We've moved to like almost predominantly aged hops, going in on the hot side, unless we wanted a more bitter, hop forward beer. But yeah, so that's kind of like how the program got built up. And, we definitely have some high acidity beers now, but we tried to, try not to overwhelm it too much or with every brand. And just last week we filled 4 puncheons with Brett only, or Brett, and there's some Hefeweizen and yeast in there actually. And one was pretty heavily hopped, and I just wanted those as blending stock to blend down. If we have something that's too acidic or something, we can blend in some pale Brett beer or hoppy Brett beer to kind of knock it back a little bit.
What's now you mentioned primarily using lacto, but you're also using bread in that fermentation in addition to the lacto. How do you keep that culture doing what you want it to do and not picking up other things along the way? Certainly, you're talking about an environment that's not necessarily impervious to other things happening in it. In that kind of barrel. So, is that just a process of tasting and pulling things out if they start going the wrong direction, or do you have some strategy for making sure that the culture stays where you want it to be?
So we've got if you looked at like what we intentionally pitched into different batches or barrels down there, there's probably a dozen different like combinations that are going on that we know of. And then there's been a lot of mixing. And so I've tried to, on that side of things, have a more holistic, free flowing, attitude towards it, and just letting the barrels kind of do what they do and dictate to us what's going on with them. To date, I have not gotten rid of any of our barrels in our sour program because they got too acidic or, we're producing really bad beer. There's probably 4 that I'm going to get rid of soon. Because they were kind of turning south in the last time we emptied them, but they weren't that bad. But we have so many barrels we can replace them with now, as we're just selling off our empty bourbon barrels. So I have more than enough stock to replace any ones that we want to get out of the program. But we've been pretty lucky there. But I've not intentionally added pediococcus to a culture, but there's probably some down there. I think there's probably some in our Flanders culture. For years, I was saving bottle dregs of lambic and things like that and dumping them into barrels and just kind of letting it be its own thing. We've got a really diverse set of flora in a sherry puncheon. That was one of our earlier fills. And so once or twice a year, we'll take that and top off any other pale sour. That's a pale base in the sherry puncheon, and just top up the barrels so we don't have the extreme evaporation loss that we saw on that initial Flanders. And then we have a couple puncheons with red that we can do that with as well if we need to. But and so that barrel has spread its culture to a lot of other barrels down there. And over time, it is kind of creating like our own, a bit of a house character. But fresh pitch barrels, we've kind of moved away from trying to seed a house culture that we're keeping. We used to keep one in carboys. And we're just buying some fresh lab pitches. But then again, with the blending and what's in the air and maybe bottle dregs once in a while and whatnot, like it's kind of becoming its own thing in time.
Sure. Zooming out from this, because we're starting to get towards the end here. How do you, thinking about all the beer that Wolf's Ridge produces, how do you maintain a standard of quality and point of view for the bigger piece, especially as the entire beer market changes. Over the last 6-7 years, as you guys have been rolling through this, the entire market has probably gone through a couple of different, significant shifts in terms of what consumers want, what they're excited by, and what they continue to ask for. But and as you have dove into some of these other things, how do you maintain that kind of consistency and quality, for the organization as a whole, especially as you've been able to grow, added a second facility? That's not an easy thing for everybody to do, but is there something that drives that for you?
I think for me, again, it starts with ingredients and trying not to experiment with ingredients too often or make too many big changes there. I'm turning away suppliers all the time who want me to try out something new or has a better price. And a lot of times I'll stick to my guns because I know what's tried and true. I know what flavors I really like. It's really hard to do better than that in my view now, but I am willing to entertain that. And we have made some changes, but so that's one key. Over the last couple of years, we've done pretty heavy implementation of sensory training at our brewery. And so we've got sales staff and brewery staff, and there's probably even some people in our tap room that are trained up on this. And we're using an app called Draft Lab that we can track brands and we can do hedonic tests, which are, just a gut check, do you like it or do you not? And, description tests where you can go into all the different chemical names and what aromas and flavors you're getting and whatnot, the color. And then you can then take that description test and then turn it into a true to brand test and see, is this batch of Daybreak on par with previous batches of Daybreak? Is there something different or standing out? And sometimes we'll get flags on that and they'll say well, people picked up on this batch of Daybreak is less roasty and fruitier. What happened there? And it's well, nothing happened other than I changed the coffee and this new coffee origin is less intense. And so sometimes that's intended and a good thing. And other times it's okay, well, we don't want to stray too far away from our number one sellers. So that's where I might cut back, where usually Daybreak is 66% house roast, which is a medium roast from one line, and then 33% of a light roast. But then sometimes that light roast is so subtle. I need a little bit more of that darker medium roast in there to balance it out, because as much as I love the light roast in that beer, if it's 100% light roast, which we've tried over the years, some people are I don't really know, I don't taste the coffee, but it's just a really floral, fruity coffee. It's not that rich, chocolatey, roasted coffee flavor. So there's a balance to be had there. With size and time comes a little bit more money to invest in things like a DO meter and something that I wish we would have had years ago, but we got one last year. And there's a world of learning to go with using a piece of equipment like that is improving our beer, but it's also just a million rabbit holes. We're oh shit, now we got to look at this, now we got to look at that. Oh wait, we changed this now.
Right.
But yeah, just trying to, holistically invest in our people and our equipment. Be careful about changing our recipes too much. But yeah, consistency is definitely one of the things that I've tried to pride ourselves on over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the next big thing on the Wolf's Ridge horizon?
It's interesting with the pandemic. It seems like to some extent anything will sell if it's in a can or even a bottle, but especially a can. Whereas, a year and a half, 2 years ago, some of these same beers would be draft only in our pub and they'd sell really, really slowly. But now, I've never brewed a Scotch ale at Wolf's Ridge because I just knew it wouldn't sell. But now we're talking about brewing one going into mid to late spring because if it's in a can, I'm pretty positive it's going to sell. So that's just really interesting. And so we're seeing things like non-barrel aged barley wine at our last bottle release sold really, really well. I sold out of cases we thought someone would make it to market to bottle shops around Columbus, and none did because everyone bought it up. And we've never sold that much barrel-aged barley wine in a day, let alone non-barrel-aged. And so that's awesome for me because I like brewing barley wine, and the more we brew it, the more we can barrel-age as well. So I hope that kind of trend continues, but we'll see. As people start going back to bars, we might not see the package sell as easily. And then we've just been having really great success with like, they're not like true pastry stouts. They're not 15 Plato finishing gravity stouts, but sweeter stouts with a bunch of chocolate in them. They're almost like a brownies theme to these beers. So we're coming up with ideas for a mixed 4-pack of those that will probably be ready in a month and a half ish. So it'll be our first mix pack that we're going to sell commercially. So it's going to be a pain in the ass to do, but I think people will love it. So it's always worth it if people love it, I think.
Well, Chris, it's been really fun to talk to you about how you do creative things with your beers while also kind of maintaining this, flavorful, flavor-forward through line through it. Before we end, G&D Chillers is the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling. Crisp Scottish pale ale malt is the workhorse of many a brewery. Get great quality and reliable supply from Old Orchard. Take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of Brewery DB and check the ABS commercial Facebook page to find out how to enter to win a keg Viking. Of course, if you'd like to support this very podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and if you're a pro brewer, consider our all access pro subscriptions that combine magazines with exclusive online content and more. For those of you who were interested in our Brewery Workshop New Brewery Accelerator, it is now sold out, and so we'll be doing another one in the fall. So stay tuned to that, and you can sign up at breweryworkshop.com for notification when that is around. So Chris, if people want to learn more about Wolf's Ridge, find your beer, come taste it in person, or find you on the internets, where do they find you?
Yeah, so we've got 2 Instagram pages, which is probably the best way. We're also on Facebook, but there's, I think it's Wolf's Ridge Brewing and Wolf's Ridge Beer. The Wolf's Ridge Beer is only beer focused. The Wolf's Ridge Brewing also includes all of our food, restaurant side as well. But really great content there. And our website, wolfsridgebrewing.com. If you're local, you can get food delivered. Right now, we're doing home delivery. Our own staff is doing it. So like we can take the full cut. We don't have to pay Chow Now or what's the name? DoorDash and Uber Eats. They're exorbitant fees. And if you're within the state of Ohio, most regions of the state, we're doing home delivery in our own vans as well. We are a self-distributed brewery, so like we can come to your doorstep still. It's been a huge part of our business since the pandemic started. Our restaurant and tap room are back open. We've got a temporary patio as we don't have any outdoor space at our current pub location downtown. But the city has a temporary permit where we've taken over half of the street and the alley and have tables set up as of yesterday. So you can sit outside and as it warms up out there. And it was really successful last year. So it'll be probably the best place to grab one of our beers in the short term anyway. So.
Well, I hope as everyone continues to get vaccinated and we move towards some semblance of normality again, that more and more of that on-premise enjoyment and experience becomes a thing for everybody. Chris, it's been great to talk to you about brewing. I appreciate you joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.